He thought he could humiliate her for entertainment. But the moment Clara Whitfield stepped toward that chessboard, the entire room had already begun to lose something it didn't yet realize: its certainty. The club was quiet in that expensive, polished way, where even the ticking clock sounded refined, where marble floors reflected golden light, and every guest wore confidence like it was part of the dress code. And at the center of it all sat Victor Hale, the grandmaster, the man who hadn't lost a public match in over a decade, his posture relaxed, his smile effortless. The kind of man who didn't just play the game but owned the room around it. And just a few feet away, unnoticed until that moment, Clara moved silently between tables, a tray balanced in her hands, her uniform plain, her presence invisible in the way only someone accustomed to being overlooked could be. And that was exactly why Daniel Cross noticed her, or rather, noticed how easy it would be to turn her into a moment, into a joke, into something the room could laugh at. So he leaned closer to Victor, voice low but sharp with amusement, suggesting they let her play just one round, something light, something entertaining. And Victor didn't hesitate, because men like him rarely did when it came to proving a point, especially when the point seemed so obvious, so harmless, so guaranteed. So he called her over with a casual flick of his hand, not even looking directly at her at first, as if the invitation itself was already more attention than she deserved. And when Clara stepped closer, there was no protest, no confusion, just a quiet stillness in her eyes that went unnoticed beneath the growing murmur of anticipation, because the room had already decided who she was, already written the ending before the first move, already settled into the comfort of watching someone out of place be reminded of it. And Victor finally looked at her then, really looked, not to understand but to measure, to confirm what he already believed, that she didn't belong at that table, that this would be quick, effortless, forgettable. And his smile widened just enough to signal to the crowd that this wasn't a match, it was a performance. And somewhere in the back, someone chuckled, then another, until the sound spread in soft waves, polite but unmistakably dismissive. And Clara set the tray down without a word, her movements calm, precise, almost too precise, as if each motion had been practiced somewhere far away from rooms like this. And for a brief second, her fingers brushed the edge of the board, adjusting a single piece that no one else had noticed was slightly off-center, not enough to matter to anyone here, but enough for her. And Victor leaned back slightly, gesturing toward the chair across from him with an exaggerated courtesy that only made the moment sharper, inviting her to sit, to play, to participate in what everyone already believed would be her quiet undoing. And as Clara lowered herself into the chair, the room leaned in just a little closer, the air tightening with expectation, with curiosity, with the subtle thrill of watching someone step into a space they weren't meant to occupy. And Victor reached for the first move, confident, relaxed, entirely in control, because in his mind, this was already over before it began. And yet, as Clara lifted her gaze to meet his for the very first time, something unspoken passed between them, something so brief it could have been imagined, but something that would, in just a few seconds, begin to unravel everything he thought he knew. And the clock ticked once, clean and sharp, as the room held its breath without even realizing why. Victor did not rush his opening, because men like him never did when they believed the outcome was guaranteed, and instead he lifted a single pawn forward with practiced ease, a move so standard it almost felt like a statement, not a strategy, as if to say that nothing about this game required effort, nothing about this opponent required thought. And a few people in the room smiled at that, recognizing the quiet arrogance in such a simple start. But Clara did not react, not with surprise, not with hesitation. Her gaze remained steady on the board as though she had already stepped beyond the moment everyone else was still watching unfold. And when her hand moved, it did so without flourish, without announcement, just a smooth, deliberate motion that placed her piece into position with a precision that did not belong to someone guessing. And that was when Victor's fingers stopped midair for the first time, just for a fraction of a second, so brief that anyone not watching closely would have missed it. But it was there, that pause, that flicker, because what she had just played was not random, not accidental, not something a beginner would stumble into. It was intentional, calculated, and, more importantly, it was familiar, though not in the way most openings were. This was something rarer, something buried in variations studied only by players who had gone far beyond the surface of the game. And Victor leaned forward slightly, the faintest shift in posture, his eyes narrowing as he examined the board again, this time not with amusement, but with focus, and around them the room had not yet caught up to that change. The soft murmurs continued, a few quiet laughs lingered, people, still expecting the inevitable, still waiting for the moment where the illusion would break and the simple woman would reveal herself as exactly what they assumed she was. But that moment did not come. Instead, the silence began to stretch in a different way, subtle at first, like a room slowly realizing something had shifted without knowing exactly what. And Daniel Cross, who had started all of this, leaned back in his chair with a grin that had not yet faded, though there was now a question forming at the edges of it. Because Victor was not playing at his usual pace, he was thinking, not long, but longer than expected, and that alone was enough to make a few heads turn. Because Victor Hale did not hesitate in matches like this, he controlled them, dictated them, ended them before they could truly begin. Yet here he was, studying the board as if it had presented him with something worth considering. And when he finally made his next move, it carried less of that earlier ease, still confident, still composed, but no longer dismissive. And Clara responded just as quickly as before, no wasted motion, no visible calculation, her hand moving as though it was following a path already decided long ago. And that was when one of the older players standing near the back leaned in closer, his expression tightening as recognition began to dawn, because he had seen something like this before, not in casual games, not in exhibitions, but in archives, in annotated matches that most people in the room had never even heard of, and the laughter that had once filled the air began to fade, not abruptly, but gradually, replaced by a growing stillness that settled over the space like a weight no one had agreed to carry. And Victor felt it too. Though he did not look up, his focus now locked onto the board, his mind moving faster, deeper, trying to trace the line she was building, trying to find the flaw, the mistake that had to be there, because in his world, someone like her did not simply sit down and play like this. It did not fit. It did not make sense. And yet the board in front of him was telling a different story, one move at a time, and Clara remained exactly the same. Calm, quiet, almost distant, as if the room, the people, the expectations surrounding her had already disappeared, leaving only the game. And somewhere between those silent exchanges of pieces, something invisible began to crack, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that anyone paying attention could feel it, the slow unraveling of certainty. The first signs that what had been meant as a joke was turning into something else entirely, something no one in that room had prepared for. And the clock ticked again, louder this time, or perhaps it only seemed that way because no one was laughing anymore. By the time the fifth exchange of moves settled onto the board, the room had changed in a way no one could quite explain, because nothing dramatic had happened, no sudden victory, no obvious mistake, and yet the air itself felt heavier, tighter, as if every person standing around that table had unconsciously taken a step closer without realizing why. And Victor Hale, who had built his reputation on controlling not just the game but the atmosphere around it, now found himself in unfamiliar territory, not losing, not yet, but no longer leading, and that distinction, subtle as it was, pressed against his thoughts with increasing weight, because every line he calculated seemed to circle back to the same unsettling truth, that Clara Whitfield was not reacting to him, she was guiding him, and that realization did not arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, through small details, through the way her pieces occupied spaces that limited his options without appearing aggressive, through the quiet efficiency of her timing, never rushed, never delayed, as if the rhythm of the game belonged to her alone. And across the table Clara remained unchanged, her expression calm, her posture steady, her attention fixed not on Victor, not on the crowd, but on the evolving pattern before her, as though the board was speaking a language she had known for years. And somewhere in the crowd, the older player who had leaned in earlier now whispered something under his breath, a phrase that only a few nearby could hear, but enough to send a ripple of unease through those who recognized it. Because the structure forming on that board was not just advanced, it was intentional in a way that suggested history, something studied, something remembered, not invented on the spot. and Daniel Cross felt that shift more than anyone, because what had begun as a moment of entertainment was slipping beyond his control, his earlier grin now replaced by a tightening jaw as he watched Victor take longer with each move. The pauses growing just enough to be noticed, just enough to disrupt the image he had relied on. And Victor knew it too, though he would never show it openly, his fingers resting lightly against the table as he scanned the board again and again, searching for a break, a weakness, a single misstep that would restore the balance he was used to. But each time he thought he had found a path forward, Clara's previous move revealed itself as something deeper, something layered, closing doors he had not even realized were there until they were already gone, and the silence that followed was no longer passive. It was charged, expectant, every shift of a piece now carrying weight far beyond the square it occupied. And when Clara reached forward again, her movement as smooth and precise as before, placing her next piece with that same quiet certainty, Victor did not move immediately this time. He could not, because the board in front of him had changed in a way that no one else yet fully understood, but he did, and that understanding settled into his chest like a cold realization, because the position he was staring at was not just difficult. It was familiar in a way that sent a faint echo through his memory, something he had studied years ago, something dismissed as theoretical, as impractical, as too precise to be executed outside of controlled analysis. And yet here it was, unfolding move by move under the steady hand of a woman everyone in that room had already decided did not belong. And Victor leaned back slightly, not in confidence, not in control, but in recognition, his eyes lifting for the briefest moment to meet Clara's, searching for confirmation of what he was beginning to suspect, and finding nothing in her expression but calm, unshaken focus. And that was when the last trace of casual arrogance disappeared from his posture, replaced by something far quieter, far more serious. Because for the first time since he had sat down, Victor Hale was no longer playing to win easily. He was playing to survive the game he had unknowingly stepped into. And around them, the room held its breath completely now, not a single voice breaking the silence. As the truth began to take shape in the minds of those watching, that this was never a joke, not for her, not for a single move, and the clock ticked again, each second stretching longer than the last as the realization spread without a word that the outcome of this game was no longer certain, and perhaps never had been. Victor did not realize the exact moment the game slipped beyond recovery, because it did not happen with a dramatic mistake or a sudden collapse. It happened quietly, buried inside a sequence of moves that looked harmless to anyone who did not understand what they were seeing. And that was the most unsettling part of all, because as he studied the board again, tracing every possible variation with the precision that had defined his entire career, he kept arriving at the same conclusion, that every path forward narrowed into something worse, not immediately, not visibly, but inevitably. And for the first time in years, Victor Hale felt something he had long forgotten in a public match, not fear, but pressure, the kind that builds slowly, invisibly, until it becomes impossible to ignore. And across from him Clara remained exactly as she had been from the beginning, her posture relaxed, her breathing steady, her attention fixed on the board with a calm that did not shift even as the tension in the room grew thicker with every passing second. And it was no longer just the older players who recognized what was happening. Whispers had spread silently through the crowd. Expressions had changed, eyes narrowed, bodies leaned closer, because even those who did not fully understand the strategy could feel the imbalance, could sense that the man who had been in control of every room he entered was now being led somewhere he had not chosen. And Daniel Cross, who had once leaned back with amusement, now sat forward with both elbows on his knees, his earlier confidence gone, replaced by a quiet unease he could not explain, because this was not how these moments were supposed to unfold. This was not how power behaved. And Victor knew he had one chance to disrupt the pattern forming against him, one moment to reclaim initiative before it was completely lost. So he shifted his strategy, abandoning the lines he would normally trust, reaching instead for something sharper, more aggressive, a calculated risk designed to force Clara into unfamiliar territory. And when he made that move, placing his piece with more force than before, a faint sound echoed across the polished table, breaking the silence just enough to draw every eye closer. And for a brief second, It looked like control might return, like the balance might shift back toward him, but Clara did not hesitate, not even for a heartbeat. Her hand moved almost immediately, guiding her next piece into position with the same quiet precision. And that was when it happened, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. Victor's expression changed, not fully, not enough for most to notice, but enough for those who were watching closely to see the truth settle in. Because the move he had just made, the risk he had taken to break free, had already been anticipated, already accounted for, already waiting for him before he even touched the piece. And the realization hit him not as shock, but as clarity, cold and exact, that he was no longer responding to a player. He was following a path that had been laid out ahead of him, step by step, move by move, and every attempt to escape only confirmed how deeply he was already inside it. And the room felt it instantly, the shift from uncertainty to understanding, the quiet recognition that this was no longer a contest of equal footing, that something far more deliberate was unfolding in front of them. And Victor leaned back slightly, his eyes fixed on the board, his mind racing through possibilities that continued to close one after another. And Clara, for the first time, allowed her gaze to lift just slightly, not to meet his, but to take in the board as a whole, as if confirming what she already knew. And then she reached forward again, slower this time, not out of hesitation, but with a kind of finality, placing her next move into position with a softness that contrasted everything it represented. Because that single move did not end the game, not yet, but it defined it, locking the structure into place in a way that could no longer be undone. And Victor saw it immediately, the line extending forward, the sequence unfolding with a precision that left no room for error, no room for recovery. And in that moment, without a word, without a gesture, the truth settled across the room completely, that the outcome had already been decided long before anyone understood what they were watching. And the silence that followed was absolute, not a whisper, not a breath breaking the stillness, as the clock ticked once more, marking the seconds of a game that was no longer about winning, but about how long it would take for everyone else to see what Clara had known from the very beginning. Victor understood it now with a clarity that left no room for denial, not because Clara had said anything, not because she had revealed herself in any obvious way, but because the board itself had become undeniable, every piece aligned with a purpose that stretched beyond the present moment. And as he stared at it, he could see the end, not as a possibility, but as a certainty, a sequence that would unfold regardless of what he chose next. And for a man who had spent his life controlling outcomes, that realization settled deeper than any loss ever could. Because this was not about being outplayed in a single exchange, it was about being guided into a position where the result had been decided long before he recognized the pattern. And the room felt it too, the tension no longer uncertain, no longer questioning, but resolved into something heavier, something quieter, as if every person standing there had reached the same conclusion at the same time, without needing to speak it aloud. And Daniel Cross sat completely still now, his earlier amusement replaced by a hollow awareness that what he had started could not be undone, that the moment he had tried to create had become something else entirely, something far beyond his control. And Clara remained exactly as she had been from the beginning, her presence steady, her movements precise, her expression untouched by the weight of the moment surrounding her, as if none of this was unexpected, as if every reaction in the room had already been accounted for. And Victor finally moved again, not with confidence, not with certainty, but because the game required it, because there was no other choice but to continue, even when the path ahead had already been revealed, and the piece he placed felt heavier than it should have, the sound it made against the board sharper in the silence, echoing in a way that drew every eye even closer. And Clara responded with the same quiet rhythm, her hand guiding the next move into place without hesitation. And that was when the final structure locked, not with force, not with drama, but with a quiet inevitability that left no room for interpretation. And Victor saw it fully now, every line, every response, every outcome, all leading to the same conclusion. And he leaned back slowly, his gaze lingering on the board as if searching for something that was no longer there, some hidden path, some overlooked detail. But there was none, and the truth settled in completely, not as defeat, but as recognition, and for a brief moment, his eyes lifted from the board to Clara, not with arrogance, not with dismissal, but with something closer to respect, though he did not speak it, because nothing needed to be said, and the room remained perfectly still, no whispers, no movement, no sound except the faint ticking of the clock marking the final seconds of a game that had already ended in everything but formality, and Clara reached forward one last time, her fingers steady as she placed the final move into position, not with triumph, not with emphasis, but with the same calm precision she had carried from the very beginning, and she withdrew her hand just as quietly, her gaze resting on the board for a brief second before she pushed her chair back and stood, not waiting for acknowledgement, not seeking reaction, simply stepping away as if the moment belonged to no one. And Victor remained seated, his eyes fixed on the position in front of him, the reality of it settling in layer by layer, while around him the room struggled to process what it had just witnessed, the silence stretching longer than anyone expected, because there was no script for this, no easy way to react when certainty had been dismantled so completely. And Daniel Cross looked down, avoiding the board, avoiding the understanding that had spread through the room, and Clara walked past them all, her steps measured, her presence returning to the quiet anonymity she had carried in with her, as if nothing had changed, as if the entire room had not just been forced to confront something it had overlooked from the very beginning. And the door closed softly behind her, leaving only the echo of that final move, and the understanding that in a room built on reputation and status, the one person they had dismissed without a second thought had been the only one who truly understood the game. No one moved for several seconds after Clara Whitfield walked out of the room, as if the space itself needed time to understand what had just happened, and Victor Hale remained seated exactly where he was, his posture still, his eyes fixed on the final position in front of him, not searching anymore, not calculating, just seeing it for what it truly was, a complete and irreversible conclusion that had been constructed with a level of precision he could not ignore, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, he exhaled, the kind of breath that comes not from exhaustion, but from acceptance, and around him the crowd began to shift, not with noise, not with immediate reaction, but with a quiet, uneasy movement as people looked at one another, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to respond when the outcome they expected had been replaced by something they could not easily explain. And Daniel Cross finally leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped together as he stared at the board, replaying the moment in his mind, the suggestion, the laughter, the confidence, all of it now echoing differently in his thoughts, stripped of its certainty. And one of the older players stepped forward, closer to the table, his eyes scanning the pieces with a depth of understanding that only came from years of study, and he shook his head slightly, not in disbelief, but in recognition, as if confirming something he had suspected but never expected to witness in person. And Victor finally spoke, his voice low, controlled, carrying just enough to reach those closest to him. And he said only a few words, not as an excuse, not as a defense, but as a statement of fact, that the game had been decided far earlier than anyone realized, and that what they had witnessed was not a mistake, not a coincidence, but intention executed without flaw. And the weight of those words settled into the room, because coming from him, they carried more than acknowledgement, they carried truth, and the silence that followed was no longer empty, it was full, filled with the understanding that something rare had just taken place, something that could not be undone or dismissed. And slowly, conversations began to form, quiet at first, voices lowered, questions asked without certainty, because no one there could reconcile what they had seen with what they believed. They understood about skill, about status, about who belonged in that room and who did not. And Victor stood at last, pushing his chair back with a controlled motion, his gaze lifting briefly toward the door Clara had exited through, not in frustration, not in anger, but in something far more measured, a quiet respect that did not need to be spoken aloud to exist. And he adjusted his jacket, the familiar gesture returning, though the confidence behind it had changed, tempered by the realization that mastery was not always visible, that it did not always announce itself in the ways people expected. And Daniel Cross remained seated a moment longer, his eyes dropping to the board once more before he looked away. the weight of his own role in the moment settling in without anyone needing to confront him directly. And as the room slowly returned to movement, the atmosphere was no longer the same. The polished certainty that had filled it earlier replaced by something quieter, something more aware, as if every person present had been forced to reconsider not just what they had seen, but how quickly they had judged, how easily they had assumed. And outside, beyond the glass and the golden light, Clara walked down the street with the same steady pace she had always carried, her presence blending into the rhythm of the city as though nothing unusual had happened at all, as though she had simply finished a task and moved on. And perhaps to her, that was exactly what it was. Because she did not look back, did not pause, did not seek acknowledgement. And in that absence of reaction lay the final truth of the moment, that what had just taken place was never about proving anything to the room, never about winning in the way they understood it, but about something far simpler, far quieter, and far more powerful. And back inside, the board remained exactly as she had left it, a silent reminder that sometimes the greatest move is not the one that ends the game, but the one that reveals it was already over from the very beginning. The board remained untouched long after the game had ended, as if no one in the room felt entitled to disturb what had been left behind, and that silence followed Victor Hale even as he stepped away from the table, each movement measured, each breath steady. But beneath that control there was something new taking shape, not doubt, not insecurity, but awareness, the kind that only comes when something undeniable forces its way into a mind that once believed it had seen everything. And as he moved toward the far side of the room, a few voices lowered instinctively, conversations pausing as he passed, not out of fear, but out of respect. Though this time it was different, because the respect was no longer built on reputation alone. It carried the weight of what had just been witnessed, and Victor did not acknowledge it, not because he dismissed it, but because his thoughts were still fixed on the sequence of moves that had led him there, replaying them with a precision that bordered on obsession, searching not for excuses, but for understanding. And every time he traced the pattern, he arrived at the same conclusion, that there had been no gap, no oversight, no moment where the outcome could have changed once it began. And that realization settled deeper than any defeat he had ever experienced, because it was not about losing control, it was about never having it in the first place. And across the room, Daniel Cross finally stood, his posture less certain than before, his confidence stripped down to something quieter, something more reflective. And he glanced once more at the board before turning away, not because he understood it, but because he could no longer pretend that it had been simple. And the older player who had recognized the pattern earlier now spoke in a low, steady voice to a small group gathered around him, explaining what they had just seen, not with excitement, but with careful respect, describing how the structure had been built from the very first move, how each response had guided the game into a position that offered no escape. And those listening leaned closer, their expressions shifting from confusion to realization, because piece by piece, the truth became clearer. That Clara Whitfield had not reacted to the game, she had defined it, and the room absorbed that understanding slowly, like a lesson that could not be ignored once seen. And Victor paused near the window, his gaze drifting outward for a brief moment before returning inward, not to the room, but to the memory of her final move, the quiet certainty with which it had been placed, and for the first time, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his expression, not one of pride, not one of amusement, but something far more restrained, a recognition of mastery that did not need to be spoken. And then he turned and walked back toward the table, not to challenge the outcome, not to reclaim anything, but simply to stand before the board once more, studying it with a different kind of focus, one that carried no urgency, only respect. And as he looked down at the arrangement of pieces, he no longer saw a loss. He saw a statement, something deliberate and complete, something that existed beyond the expectations of the room that had witnessed it. And behind him, the quiet conversations continued, spreading outward, reshaping the atmosphere in subtle ways, because no one there could return to the comfort of their earlier assumptions, not after seeing what they had just seen. And outside, Clara moved further into the city, her figure blending into the flow of people and light, unnoticed once again, her presence dissolving back into the world as if it had never stepped into that room at all. And yet the impact of her absence lingered inside, not as a disruption, but as a shift, a recalibration of understanding that would not fade quickly. And as Victor finally stepped away from the board for the last time, the truth settled fully into place, not just for him, but for everyone who had been there. That greatness does not announce itself. It does not seek recognition. It simply appears, undeniable in its execution, and leaves before anyone fully understands what they have just witnessed. The conversations that filled the room no longer carried the same tone they had just minutes before, because something fundamental had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that quietly reshaped how every person there understood what they had witnessed, and the board at the center of it all remained untouched, almost preserved, as if moving even a single piece would somehow diminish the clarity of what had taken place. And Victor Hale stood a short distance away now, no longer the focal point of admiration he had been earlier, but something different, something more grounded. And as he listened to the low voices around him, to the fragments of analysis and speculation, he did not interrupt, he did not correct, because he knew that no explanation offered in that moment would fully capture what had happened, not in a way that mattered. And the older player continued speaking quietly, his tone steady, almost reverent, as he described the opening again, pointing out how the first move had not been bold or flashy, but precise, how it had quietly set the direction for everything that followed. And those gathered leaned closer, drawn not by excitement, but by the need to understand, to reconcile what they had assumed with what they now knew to be true. And Daniel Cross stood among them for a moment before stepping back, his gaze drifting toward the entrance, as if expecting Clara to reappear, though he knew she would not, because people like her did not linger. They did not wait for recognition. They simply moved on, leaving others to catch up to what had already been done. And the realization settled into him slowly, that the moment he had tried to create had revealed something about himself he had not intended to show. And he looked away, his earlier confidence replaced by a quiet discomfort that did not need to be voiced. And Victor finally stepped forward again, returning to the table not as a performer, not as a figure of authority, but as a student of the game. And he studied the board one last time, not searching for mistakes, but acknowledging the structure for what it was, complete, deliberate, and beyond revision. And as he reached out, his hand hovered briefly over the pieces before gently resetting a single one, not to change the outcome, but to restore the board to its neutral state. And even that simple act felt different now, more intentional, more aware, and the soft sound of wood against wood echoed faintly as the pieces shifted back into place, breaking the stillness just enough to signal that the moment, while lasting in memory, had reached its natural end. And the room began to move again, people stepping back, conversations widening, the rhythm of the space slowly returning, but not completely, because something remained, something unspoken that lingered beneath every word, every glance. And as Victor turned away from the table, he paused briefly, his eyes lifting toward the door one last time, not expecting anything, not hoping, simply acknowledging that the person who had changed the room was no longer in it. And outside, the city carried on as it always did, indifferent to what had taken place within those polished walls. And Clara walked among it without drawing a single glance, her presence as quiet as it had always been, her steps steady, her mind already somewhere else, as if the game had been just another moment in a life filled with many others no one had seen. And back inside, the lesson settled deeper. With each passing second, not through speeches or declarations, but through the absence of them, through the quiet understanding that had replaced the earlier certainty. And as the lights reflected softly across the marble floor once more, the room held on to one final truth that no one would say out loud, that the person they had dismissed without hesitation had not just played the game better than anyone else in that room. She had redefined what it meant to truly understand it, and in doing so, had left behind something far more lasting than victory, a silence that carried meaning long after the pieces had been put away. By the time the last of the guests began to leave, the room had returned to its polished stillness, but it was not the same stillness that had existed before, because now it carried memory, and memory has weight, and that weight lingered in every corner, in every quiet glance, in every unfinished thought that no one felt entirely comfortable expressing aloud. and Victor Hale stood near the entrance for a moment, watching as the final few conversations faded into low murmurs before disappearing completely, and when the room was nearly empty, he turned back once more, his eyes settling on the table where everything had shifted, and for a brief second, it was as if he could still see the game unfolding, each move layered with intention, each moment leading to a conclusion that had never truly been in question, and he did not attempt to rewrite it in his mind, did not search for an alternate path, because he understood now that there had not been one, and that understanding did not diminish him. It refined him, because mastery is not defined by never being challenged, but by recognizing when something greater has been witnessed. And across the city, Clara Whitfield had already disappeared into the rhythm of her life, her steps carrying her through familiar streets, past storefronts that reflected her image only for a moment before letting it pass. And there was nothing in her expression to suggest that anything extraordinary had taken place, no trace of triumph, no sign of reflection, just the same quiet presence she had always carried, as if the game had not been an event, but a continuation of something that had existed long before anyone in that room had noticed her. And that was perhaps the most unsettling truth of all, that what had seemed impossible to those watching had been, to her, entirely natural. And back inside, Victor finally stepped away from the table for the last time, the echo of his footsteps soft against the marble floor, and he paused at the doorway, his hand resting briefly against the frame as he looked out into the city beyond, not searching for her, not expecting anything, but simply acknowledging that the moment had passed and would not return. And in that quiet pause, something settled into place within him, not as defeat, but as clarity, the kind that reshapes how a person sees not just the game, but the people who play it. And he stepped out into the night, the door closing behind him with a soft, final sound that seemed to seal the memory inside, and the board, now reset, stood ready for the next game, the next challenge, the next display of skill. But those who had been there would never look at it the same way again, because they had seen what it looked like when true mastery revealed itself. Without warning,